the bright lights of Joe Rogan's Texas studio cast a stark glow on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's determined face as she settled into her seat, directly opposite the world's most influential podcaster. With over 11 million listeners already tuned in live, the tension in the room was palpable, almost electric. Just moments before the broadcast began, Rogan had leaned into his producer, Jamie, and whispered, "She's just another politician who doesn't know what she's talking about. I'm going to expose her lack of real credentials today." What Rogan didn't realize was that Crockett had overheard every word. Through her earpiece, which technicians had activated a little too early, his dismissive comment resonated. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, yet her composed expression never wavered. This Harvard-educated lawyer and congressional representative from Texas wasn't just any politician. She had come armed with meticulously gathered evidence, ready to transform what was intended as an ambush interview into the most shocking episode of the Joe Rogan Experience this year. "My guest today is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," Rogan began, his voice carrying that familiar, casual confidence. "She claims to fight for everyday Americans, but some critics say she's just another career politician with no real-world experience." The subtle, almost imperceptible emphasis on claims immediately set the tone. This wouldn't be a friendly chat, it was going to be an interrogation. What unfolded next left millions of viewers utterly stunned. Crockett calmly pulled out her phone and played a recording that Rogan never, in a million years, expected to hear. Within minutes, the tables would completely turn, leaving one of the world's most confident interviewers visibly speechless. Before we dive deeper into this explosive encounter, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming political showdowns. Joe Rogan leaned back in his chair, his signature black t-shirt a stark contrast against the deep red backdrop of his studio. At 56, Rogan had meticulously built an empire from his podcast, a platform where he famously grilled everyone from groundbreaking scientists to controversial celebrities with his blunt, no-nonsense style. His vast following celebrated him as the authentic voice of the everyman, fearlessly unafraid to challenge the establishment. Today, his target was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. "So, you've been in Congress for how long now?" Rogan asked, making no effort to mask the skepticism in his voice. "I'm in my second term," Crockett replied calmly, her dark blazer and confident posture reflecting her extensive background as a courtroom lawyer. At 42, she had rapidly risen through the political ranks after a distinguished career defending civil rights cases throughout Texas. "And before that, what real-world experience do you actually have?" Rogan pressed, his tone dripping with prejudgment. "Because a lot of people say politicians like you go straight from law school to politics without ever having a real job." His question hung in the air, clearly implying he'd already decided on her answer. Crockett's eyes flashed briefly, but her voice remained perfectly measured. "That's a common misconception about my background, Joe. One I'm happy to correct today." Behind the scenes, Rogan's producer, Jamie, was busy pulling up a stream of social media comments about Crockett, most of them critical, questioning her qualifications. These were slated to appear on screens for Rogan to reference throughout the interview. The strategy was clear: paint Crockett as an out-of-touch elitist who couldn't possibly understand the daily struggles of everyday Americans. For Crockett, however, this wasn't just about defending her personal reputation. Recent polls showed public trust in Congress at historic lows. Americans increasingly viewed their representatives as utterly disconnected from reality, a perception Rogan was clearly exploiting. If she couldn't effectively counter his narrative today, it wouldn't just damage her image, it would reinforce the pervasive cynicism that was actively eroding democratic institutions themselves. What viewers didn't know was that Crockett had spent weeks diligently preparing for this very moment. She had watched hundreds of hours of Rogan's interviews, meticulously studying how he cornered his guests. She had even compiled a digital folder on her tablet, labeled simply "Evidence." Unlike many politicians who arrived armed only with pre-approved talking points, Congresswoman Crockett had brought receipts. "Let me be very clear about something," Rogan continued, leaning forward. "I've got nothing against you personally, but my listeners want authenticity. They're tired of politicians who claim to represent people when they've never walked in their shoes. So, I think it's fair to ask, What makes you qualified to represent everyday Americans when your experience seems limited to courtrooms and committee rooms? The question wasn't merely a challenge to Crockett, it was a rallying cry to Rogan's millions of followers, many of whom were nodding along, convinced they were about to witness another establishment figure exposed as a fraud. But as Crockett reached for her tablet, something in her confident smile suggested she might have a very unexpected surprise in store. "Joe, I appreciate your directness," Crockett said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had navigated countless hostile courtrooms. "But I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about my background that I'd like to clear up." Rogan nodded, his expression a polite but unmistakable skepticism. "Sure, go ahead. You mentioned real-world experience. Before Harvard Law School, I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to put myself through college. Overnight shifts at a gas station, daytime office work, and weekend retail." She paused, letting that sink in. "After becoming an attorney, I spent years representing people who simply couldn't afford legal help. Domestic violence victims, wrongfully evicted families, workers denied their rightful paychecks." Rogan cut in, dismissively. "That's the standard political bio, though, isn't it? Every candidate has some version of 'I worked hard and helped people.' I'm talking about understanding what regular Americans deal with today. Rising prices, crime, border issues." The attention in the studio noticeably intensified. Jamie, Rogan's producer, quickly pulled up a tweet criticizing Crockett's voting record on a border security bill. Rogan pointed to it on his monitor. "See, this person says you voted against border security funding that would have helped everyday Texans. How do you square that with representing your constituents?" Crockett's expression didn't change, but she straightened slightly in her chair. "That bill included provisions that would have separated families and violated due process rights. But let's address your core concern about whether I understand regular Americans." She tapped her tablet, bringing up a document. "Here's something interesting. A survey showing 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. I know what that's like, because just 5 years ago, I was still paying off student loans while trying to keep my legal practice afloat." Rogan shrugged. "A lot of successful people have student loans. That doesn't. I had to choose between filling my prescription medications and paying my electric bill," Crockett continued, her voice still calm, but now infused with a deeper intensity. "I've had my car repossessed. I've received eviction notices." For a brief moment, Rogan seemed genuinely taken aback, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Look, I appreciate personal struggles, but individual experiences don't necessarily translate to effective policy. Let's talk about your actual record in Congress." Jamie instantly pulled up another social media post, this one questioning Crockett's committee attendance record. "This says you missed key committee votes on inflation measures. Your constituents are suffering from high prices, but you weren't even there to vote on solutions." The accusation hung heavy in the air. The camera caught Rogan's expression, confident he'd landed a significant blow. Crockett nodded slowly, then reached for her phone. "I expected this might come up. Let me play something for you." She pressed a button, and a recorded voice filled the studio, "Committee meeting rescheduled due to chairperson's request. All votes postponed until next session." That was the official announcement, she explained, looking directly at Rogan. "The votes never happened on the day that post claims I missed them. They were rescheduled, and congressional records show I was present and voting." She turned her tablet toward Rogan, clearly displaying the official congressional attendance record. "The post you're citing is spreading misinformation. And I wonder if your team verified it before bringing it up." Jamie, the producer, looked noticeably uncomfortable. Rogan's expression tightened slightly. "We tried to vet everything, but it would have taken one Google search to verify," Crockett interjected, her tone still professional, but with an unmistakable edge. "This is exactly the problem with political discourse today. Misinformation spreads faster than truth." Rogan shifted in his chair, visibly reassessing his entire approach. "Fair enough on that point. Let's move to something more substantive. Your critics say you're out of touch with working-class concerns. Your education, Harvard Law, suggests a certain privilege that most Americans don't have. Crockett smiled slightly. Joe, do you know how I paid for Harvard? Scholarships, partially, but I also worked security shifts overnight and took out loans that I only finished paying off 3 years ago. I lived in subsidized housing because it was all I could afford. I ate ramen for dinner most nights. Does that sound like privilege to you? Rogan's expression was becoming increasingly difficult to read. He was accustomed to controlling the narrative of his interviews, but Crockett was consistently countering his assumptions with specific, undeniable facts. Let's talk policy, then, he said, swiftly changing tactics. You supported the infrastructure bill that many critics say was full of wasteful spending. How do you justify that to taxpayers? Crockett tapped her tablet again. I'm glad you asked. She pulled up a detailed map of Texas. These red dots represent critical infrastructure projects in my district that were funded by that bill. Bridges that were literally crumbling, water systems contaminated with lead, schools without internet access. I can show you before and after pictures of each project if you'd like. The tension continued to build as Rogan tried different angles, and Crockett consistently responded with specific, verifiable evidence rather than vague talking points. Viewers in the live chat began commenting on the unexpected direction of the interview. Jamie, pull up that clip of Congresswoman Crockett at the border, Rogan commanded, pivoting again. A video appeared on screen, showing Crockett speaking at a press conference with the caption, Crockett claims border crisis is manufactured. Can you explain this statement? Rogan asked, his tone suggesting he'd finally found his gotchas moment. Crockett leaned forward, her expression intensifying. I'd be happy to explain it, Joe, but first I need to point out something important about that clip. That video has been edited. Crockett stated firmly, reaching for her tablet. Let me show you the complete statement. She tapped the screen and turned it toward the camera. A video began to play, showing her full remarks. Some politicians are claiming there's a manufactured crisis at the border to scare voters, but what we actually have is a real humanitarian challenge that needs real solutions, not rhetoric. The studio fell silent for a moment. Rogan stared at the screen, then back at Crockett. The clip your team played cuts off the first half of my sentence, completely changing its meaning, she continued, her voice clear and precise. And it's been circulating on social media for months, despite multiple fact-checkers debunking it. Rogan looked at his producer. Jamie, did we verify the full context of this? Jamie, visible on camera for the first time, looked uncomfortable. We pulled it from a verified account, but no, we didn't check the original source. This happens to me constantly, Crockett said, her voice firm but not accusatory. And it's exactly why I came prepared today, because I knew you'd present me with these kinds of misleading clips and posts. Rogan shifted in his chair, visibly recalibrating his approach. Look, if the clip was edited misleadingly, that's not what we're about here. Let's set that aside and talk about your actual position on border security. I'm happy to discuss that, Crockett replied. But first, I think your viewers deserve to know something important. You began this interview questioning my qualifications and suggesting I don't understand everyday Americans. Let me address that directly. She opened a folder on her tablet and began scrolling through images. These are photos from my district office's casework files, with names and identifying details removed for privacy. She showed pictures of herself meeting with constituents in modest homes, at bustling community centers, and on neighborhood streets. Last year alone, my office helped over 3,000 constituents navigate federal agencies to get the benefits they deserved. Veterans fighting for their health care, seniors struggling with Social Security payments, families facing foreclosure after job losses. She continued scrolling through the images. This is Maria, a single mother who lost her home in a flood. Federal relief funds were delayed for months until my office intervened. This is James, a Vietnam veteran who was denied benefits for Agent Orange exposure until we helped him appeal. Rogan watched silently as she continued. Before I was in Congress, I personally represented over 500 clients as a public interest attorney, people who couldn't afford legal help but faced eviction, job discrimination, or criminal charges without adequate representation. I lived in the same neighborhoods they did. I shopped at the same grocery stores. I worried about the same rising costs. She paused, meeting Rogan's gaze directly. Joe, you began this interview suggesting I'm out of touch with real Americans, but with respect, I'm not sure you've actually investigated what I do daily or where I come from. The shift in the studio's atmosphere was palpable. Rogan, known for his relentless directness, seemed to recognize he'd profoundly underestimated his guest. Fair enough, he said, a touch of humility in his voice. But let's talk about some specific policies where critics say you're wrong. I welcome that conversation, Crockett replied. But I'd like to address one more thing first. She pulled up a social media post on her tablet, one Rogan had referenced earlier about her supposedly missing important votes. The account that posted this, she said, enlarging the profile, was created 3 months ago, has posted over 2,000 times, all politically divisive content, and appears to use an AI-generated profile picture. She swiped to show a forensic analysis. This is what's called a sock puppet account, likely part of a coordinated disinformation campaign. How do you know that? Rogan asked, genuinely curious now. Because my team and I have been working with social media researchers to track disinformation targeting members of Congress, she explained. We've identified patterns in these attacks. The same false narratives, often from newly created accounts, spread in coordinated waves before important votes or appearances, like this one. She pulled up a chart showing spikes in negative social media mentions containing identical phrases about her, all occurring within minutes of each other from different accounts. This isn't organic criticism from voters, she explained. It's a manufactured narrative designed to seem like widespread public opinion. Rogan leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. So, you're saying there's an organized effort to discredit you specifically? Not just me, Crockett clarified. Many representatives face this, but I've been targeted particularly aggressively since I spoke out about election security issues. She pulled up another document for threat assessment from Capitol Police, showing she'd received more violent threats than almost any other freshman representative. This is what happens when these disinformation campaigns succeed, she said quietly. Real people act on false information. The mood in the studio had completely transformed. What began as Rogan's attempt to expose Crockett as an out-of-touch politician had become a masterclass in how disinformation spreads and impacts public discourse. Here's where I think we might actually agree, Joe, she said. You often talk about the importance of having authentic conversations and cutting through BS. That's exactly what I'm trying to do in Congress, but it's nearly impossible when people can't even agree on basic facts. Rogan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. So, what's the solution? How do we fix that? Crockett set down her tablet. First, by doing exactly what we're doing right now, having conversations where we challenge each other but remain open to evidence. Second, by all of us becoming more careful about what we share and believe online. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, printed document, her complete voting record with detailed annotations explaining each vote. I brought this for you and your team. Every vote I've cast, with explanations of why, not talking points, but actual policy rationales. I want your listeners to have this information directly from the source. Rogan took the document, flipping through it with visible surprise at its sheer detail. This is unusually thorough, he admitted. Because I believe voters deserve real transparency, she replied. Not snippets or sound bites, but the full context of how I'm representing them. The conversation had fundamentally shifted. What began as a combative interrogation had transformed into a substantive discussion about governance, media literacy, and the critical challenges facing democracy. I came here expecting a different conversation, Rogan admitted, his usual bravado replaced with genuine reflection. I think a lot of us, myself included, have gotten used to seeing politicians as these cardboard cutouts who just repeat talking points. That's exactly the problem, Crockett responded. We reduce each other to caricatures instead of engaging with the complexity of actual human beings and their ideas. For the first time in the interview, Rogan smiled genuinely. I think we might need to go longer than the scheduled 3 hours. The camera pulled back, showing both of them, the initial adversarial positioning now replaced by a posture of mutual respect and genuine dialogue. What viewers were witnessing wasn't just a politician defending herself, it was a masterclass in how evidence and preparation could overcome even the most deeply entrenched narratives. As the interview entered its 4th hour, breaking the show's typical format, the conversation between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Joe Rogan had evolved into something neither his audience nor media observers had anticipated. Social media was exploding with reactions, Rogan-Crockett debate trending #1 worldwide with over 500,000 tweets. Before we wrap up, Rogan said, his tone notably different from the combative stance he'd taken at the interview's start, I want to circle back to something important. I came in with certain assumptions about you and your background that weren't accurate, and I think that's worth acknowledging. Crockett nodded, her posture relaxed but still maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized her throughout. I appreciate that, Joe, and I hope your listeners take away something valuable from this conversation, namely, that it's worth digging deeper than headlines and social media posts before forming opinions about people or policies. The interview concluded with a handshake that immediate online commentary described as surprisingly warm given how it started. But the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, clips from the exchange began circulating widely across platforms. The moment where Crockett revealed the deceptively edited border crisis video garnered particular attention, with media analysis sites using it as a case study in misinformation tactics. Political commentators from across the spectrum weighed in. What we witnessed today was the rare politician who came prepared not with talking points, but with verifiable evidence, noted political analyst Michael Steele on MSNBC. Regardless of whether you agree with Crockett's politics, her methodical dismantling of misinformation was a masterclass in media literacy, wrote conservative commentator S.E. Cupp. On Fox News, the reaction was more measured but still notable. Congresswoman Crockett presented her case effectively, said anchor Brett Baer. It raises important questions about how we all consume and share political content. The podcast metrics revealed another surprising outcome. Unlike the typical drop-off rate for long-form content, viewership actually increased during the later hours of the Crockett interview. Audience retention analysis showed particular spikes during the segments where she presented evidence contradicting widespread narratives about her record. 3 days after the interview aired, Joe Rogan addressed the conversation on his next podcast. That Crockett interview has gotten more response than almost anything we've done this year, he told his listeners. And look, I've never had a problem admitting when I get something wrong. I went in thinking she was another politician who talks a lot but doesn't really connect with regular people. I was wrong about that. And what's interesting is how many messages I've gotten from listeners saying it made them rethink how they evaluate politicians in general. For Crockett, the aftermath brought both opportunity and intensified scrutiny. Her office reported a 300% increase in media requests, and her social media following grew by over 200,000 across platforms within a week. More substantively, her detailed policy proposal on judicial reform, previously ignored by major outlets, was now being discussed seriously in legislative circles. The Congresswoman's office has been flooded with constituent services requests from outside her district, reported her communications director. People saw how effectively she addressed community needs and want that same kind of representation. Not all reactions were positive, however. The same network of accounts Crockett had identified during the interview began pushing new narratives, claiming the entire exchange was rehearsed or that Rogan had gone soft on her. Several high-profile political operatives publicly criticized Rogan for giving a platform to her radical agenda without challenging her strongly enough. These attacks reached a crescendo when a seemingly authentic leaked preparation document appeared online, purporting to show Rogan's team had provided questions to Crockett in advance. Both Rogan and Crockett immediately denounced the document as a forgery. This is exactly the kind of sophisticated disinformation operation I described during the interview, Crockett stated in a press release. The document contains formatting inconsistencies and reference points that don't align with how Joe's team actually operates. It's a fabrication designed to undermine the credibility of our conversation. Digital forensics experts quickly confirmed her assessment, identifying telltale signs of AI-generated content in the leaked document. The incident itself became a case study in how disinformation evolves in response to effective counter-messaging. Perhaps the most significant outcome emerged 2 weeks later when the House Ethics Committee announced a bipartisan working group on digital literacy and disinformation, with Crockett named as co-chair alongside Representative Nancy Mace. Our conversation with Representative Crockett highlighted something that transcends partisan politics. The announcement quoted Mace. "When Americans can't distinguish fact from fiction, our entire democratic system is at risk." The initiative would create resources for constituents on identifying reliable sources, understanding context, and critically evaluating political claims, directly addressing the issues Crockett had highlighted in her conversation with Rogan. Media analysis of the Rogan-Crockett exchange continued for months, with journalism schools incorporating segments into their curriculum on interview preparation and evidence-based reporting. The Columbia Journalism Review published an extensive analysis titled "When Preparation Meets Opportunity: Lessons from the Crockett-Rogan Interview for Everyday Americans." The impact manifested in unexpected ways. Social media platforms reported a measurable decrease in sharing of unverified political content in the weeks following the interview, with users more frequently requesting sources or questioning context before amplifying claims. Comment sections on subsequent Rogan episodes revealed listeners applying new levels of scrutiny to his guests' assertions, frequently referencing the Crockett interview as a turning point in how they consumed media. "Ever since the Crockett episode, I've been fact-checking stuff before I share it. She was right about how easy it is to spread misinformation without realizing it," one listener commented. "I didn't agree with her politics going in. Still don't on many issues, but I respect how she backed everything up with evidence. Wish more politicians would do that," wrote another. 6 months later, Crockett and Rogan reunited for a follow-up conversation, this time with a distinctly different dynamic. From the start, they discussed the working group's progress, ongoing challenges in political communication, and the measurable impacts of their initial conversation. "What's been most surprising," Crockett noted during this second interview, "is how many colleagues from both parties have approached me privately to discuss how they might better connect their policy work to constituents' actual experiences. There's a recognition that the standard political playbook isn't working anymore." Rogan nodded. "I think what resonated with people about our first conversation wasn't that we agreed on everything, we definitely didn't. It was that we moved past the surface-level talking points to something more substantive." The original interview ultimately garnered over 30 million views across platforms, making it one of the most watched political conversations of the year. More importantly, it established a new benchmark for political discourse, one where evidence, context, and direct engagement replace sound bites and partisan assumptions. For Crockett, the experience reinforced her approach to public service. "My job isn't to win every argument or to be liked by everyone," she reflected in a later interview. "It's to represent my constituents honestly and to engage with criticism directly rather than hiding behind talking points." For Rogan, it represented an evolution in his approach to political guests. "That conversation changed how we prepare for and conduct interviews with public officials," he acknowledged. "We dig deeper into primary sources now, not just what's circulating on social media." And for the millions who witnessed the exchange, it offered something increasingly rare in political discourse, a moment where substance triumphed over style, where evidence overcame assumption, and where two people from different perspectives found common ground in a shared commitment to truth. The lesson for America was clear: in an era of deepening division and proliferating misinformation, preparation, evidence, and good faith engagement remain powerful antidotes to cynicism and polarization. As we continue to navigate these challenging waters of modern political discourse, conversations like the one between Congresswoman Crockett and Joe Rogan remind us that breakthrough moments are possible when we come armed with facts rather than just opinions.